Hey designers, welcome back to the studio. Today we're going to take a jump now from our two-dimensional printed templates to the folded pieces to now actually adding some of that wooden framing to the outside. So let's gather up a couple of materials that we're going to need and get into this one. So to get started, grab a hold of your balsa or basswood strips. You've got probably more than what you need if you're following along with my octahedron form. I'll have a little bit extra, but we'll do a little bit of measuring here just to make sure that you have enough pieces for your design. Make sure you've got that PVA glue and the brush from your watercolor kit. The brush I'm going to use is that detailing brush again. The bristles on this brush are just the right size for brushing right along the edges of this balsa strip, so that's a good brush for that. Since the glue that we're using dries so quickly, let's keep a dish of water around and maybe even an old rag that you can dab off on. You also may find that having a little bit of scrap paper around, this is actually just scrap cardboard, to prevent overgluing, to keep the glue off your cutting mat or whatever other surface you're working on. And then either a scrap of this is actually like cereal box cardboard, or maybe a 3x5 note card, something that's a little bit thicker than a piece of paper. I'll explain why you need that here in a second. You're also going to need your X-Acto blade. And usually I'd be really concerned about getting a fresh blade on here, but actually we're going to use a part of the blade that almost never gets used in our normal production. We're going to end up cutting with a sort of back edge of the blade here, and this part of the blade almost never gets dull because we generally do all of our cutting way out here at the point. We're going to do almost all of our cutting back here, so even if you have some old dull blades laying around, they're probably still sharp enough for this project. So keep your X-Acto handy. And then we'll be using your cutting mats. I've got a larger cutting mat to work with here for the sake of the demonstration, but you should be able to use the one in the back of your sketchbook, no problem. Okay, so before we actually start cutting and gluing our wood strips, let's take sort of a precautionary step against accidentally getting halfway through our project and running out of wood, since there's a very small chance that you'll be able to find any more of this to finish the project. Let's measure out roughly how much wood we have in comparison to how much wood we're going to need for the designs. For that, some kind of ruler or tape measure would be really handy. Just happen to have this small Taylor's tape measure around, and what I'm going to do is just sort of get a rough measurement of my overall stick length. I'm going to refer to these as my sticks, and I believe I cut these down in the studio to about 18 inches or so of those, and I'll count those out. I've got 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8 of these pieces. Double check and make sure you know how many you have and about how long they are. So I'm going to do a little bit of quick math here. So each stick is 18 inches end to end, and I've got 8 of those pieces. That's going to be good to know because I want to make sure that the templates that I've printed aren't going to require more wood than what I have available to me. So now what I want to do is I just want to check my printed template. Since we're going to build this thing to scale, I want to check my printed template and make sure that I have enough wood here. So I'm going to make my measurements as carefully as I can, but if I'm going to make any mistakes at all, I want to err on the side of having measurements that are a little bit too long, and you'll maybe understand why here in a minute. I don't want my measurements to end up on the short side. And so one leg of my equilateral triangles that I'm printing here is about 2¼ inches long. That's fairly straightforward to remember, but I could even just err that up to, say, 3 inches. So if I've got my stick measurements up here, I'm going to think about my equilateral triangles here. And the equilateral triangles are actually going to be 3 separate pieces of wood, and each one of those legs is going to be 3 inches long. That means for one equilateral triangle, I'm going to need 9 total inches of stick. That means that one stick is going to get me 2 triangles. Now I guess my bigger question then would be, well, how many triangles am I going to need for my overall piece? This is an octahedron, so I got 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8 sides. So if I'm going to get 2 triangles out of one stick, I'm going to need 4 sticks. I should have plenty here, maybe even have enough for another project here, because I have 8 of these sticks. Just make sure for your own design, especially if you're working with a design that's different than my provided template, that you've got enough lumber to take care of your project. So to get into the process of actually starting to glue these things down, we're going to talk just really carefully about how the actual process of sort of cutting and laying these things into place will go. You may be tempted to just measure out carefully each leg of your equilateral triangle and bulk cut every single piece. So you just kind of do the math, right? Three legs per triangle times 8 triangles. You know, you just kind of cut all 24 pieces or so. I'm going to caution you against that, and that has to do with just sort of like slight differences in measurements and angle cutting that are all going to happen right at the corners of your triangles. I'll just say this, not each piece is going to end up being the same length. I know that sort of mathematically an equilateral triangle would be equal length all the way around, but we're actually going to be manufacturing this and lapping the joints differently, and so each leg is going to get progressively shorter as we glue them down around the outside of the design. I find that instead of precisely measuring out each piece as we go, it's just easier to sort of cut and mark all along the line. So let's take care of that process. Let's kind of go through a quick demonstration of how that might work. I'm going to start on one end of my template and just start gluing the wood down, and I'm going to make the decision to use the inside edge, the outside edge of the equilateral triangle being the sort of inside of the wood. So as I'm carefully lining that up, I want to make sure that I'm not gluing it to the outside. The biggest reason I'm doing that is I want to be able to easily see where that alignment mark will be. Now I'm also going to be very careful to cut the bevel angles of this triangle. I'm going to carefully line up the balsa wood strip right in place on where it's going to be, and then use the blade to sort of follow along the pre-existing path of the line and just mark the end of the balsa. Now the balsa is so soft that it's just going to slice right through. It won't take hardly any effort to mark it, even less effort to slice it through. Now the balsa wood has about the consistency of almost like a dense sponge or like a hard foam. If you happen to get basswood in your kit, or what's called the linden, American linden, it's a little bit stiffer. It'll kind of give a little snap when you cut it, but should still slice pretty easily. Both of these woods work really, really well for this project. You'll find that the balsa wood is a little bit lighter and a little bit softer to cut, but it's a little bit stiffer. It resists bending a bit more. The basswood is a little bit more flexible, but it's going to be a little bit harder to cut. So once I've got my initial piece marked on one end, I have my left-hand side beveled. I'm going to bevel cut the opposite side. And I'll start by marking it. And I bring that mark over here to the cutting mat, and I'll just use the kind of weight of my thumb to push straight through. Now I'll just double check that measurement again to make sure I'm not overhanging the edge of my guides too much. You'll find that on some ends of these pieces of wood there's a small barcode printed. I recommend just sort of that being your glue side. Make that glue side down. Once your bevel cuts are made, you're pretty much committed to making that your glue side down edge. And I'll put a little bit of glue on the back side of this wood. I'll use that scrap piece of cardboard. And the scrap piece of cardboard prevents me from accidentally over gluing and getting glue all over the place. Try to only get glue on the edge that's going to be touching paper. Otherwise, it'll pretty quickly get all over your fingers. PVA glue is a great option for this again because a couple things. It dries flexible and it dries very, very quickly. So this won't take too long to get your piece mocked up. Pay very, very close attention to getting it lined up right along the edge of your design. And then I'm going to put a few fingers worth of pressure all the way down the length of that stick and press for about 5-10 seconds or so to make sure that that bond is good. And that stick is pretty much cured and set and ready to go, and I'll just kind of move on right along the line. Now if you want a really nice clean edge without any glue blobbing out the sides, you can take a small scrap of cardboard or eventually even a small scrap of wood and just kind of like kiss out that little bit of over gluing or glue that ooched out the sides there. That will not only clean up your design, but it'll allow your design or allow your final piece to fold much easier. Now because I've already bevel cut this end of the stick, I'm going to make that the kind of, I'm going to end up using that bevel cut and line that up with the next piece. So lay in that next piece of balsa and allow the beveled edge to come right up to my first glued piece. Butt that right up against the line that I have already along the edge of my template. And then using the line on the other side of my template, mark the balsa strip with a small notch. Once I have that notch marked, I'll come in with my blade and with a little bit of pressure from my thumb, push straight down on that blade. And it should cut a nice clean edge. Now, as these two corners come together, it's a really good idea to make sure that you're not only getting glue between wood and paper, but also right in the crack there between wood and wood. Now, as I am assembling the piece, that little bit of glue in between there is not going to get a whole lot, not going to do a whole lot of holding, but when I fold my design later on, that little glued corner is going to be really important. Now I made sort of a mess of that, so I'm going to come in with my rag and lift any glue that was over glued. Now that joint should not only be gluing paper to paper, but also wood to wood. Now the last piece of each equilateral triangle can be a little bit tricky because I can't easily measure this piece without it sort of being raised or lifted. So eyeball right down your existing cut path, and you'll notice that this leg will always be the short leg because it's overlapping the other two. I'll check that one for fit, and if it doesn't want to sneak in there, I'll just come in and shave just a tiny little bit off of the inside. Now, in between each triangle, or in between each day that you're going to be working on this, you may find that using a little bit of clamping pressure isn't a bad way to keep this thing flat. If you happen to have something heavy sitting around that you can just place carefully over the edge, something that has a nice flat edge, that'd be great. Big heavy paperweight or a book or something like that would just sort of keep that clamped down while the glue dries. Now the glue, the PVA glue that we're using, should dry within about 30 seconds or so But you know, it's always not a bad idea just to kind of be careful. The paper will warp depending on different layers of humidity, and we're adding some humidity to that paper with the glue. It's also not a bad idea to make sure that this brush gets rinsed out. You know, if you're going to take a 2 or 3 minute break or something like that, bring it over to the water dish. Just kind of give it a quick rinse. Don't leave the brush in the water overnight. These wood brushes have a lacquered wood handle, and the water will suck up the handle and crack all the lacquer off the outside. So after you rinse it off, make sure those bristles are clear, and that'll be ready for the next time you come back to work on it. I'll glue up one more triangle here for this demonstration, and then it's just a matter of you kind of slowly working your way down the line. When I lay in my first cut strip for this next piece, I want to make sure that I'm adding just a tiny little bit of space in between the two facets, or in between the two sides, to ensure that there's enough paper to make that fold. So we'll use that little bit of thickness of cardboard again. Again, this is about the thickness of a maybe cereal box or so. And that's going to end up creating just a tiny little bit of space in between those two equilateral triangle facets, so that when the fold happens in the design, there's just enough paper in between that fold that it'll fold nice and easy. If you butt the wood right up against each other, there's a good chance that some glue will ooch up in between those two, and the glue will actually prevent your piece from folding up later on, and that's no good. So I already have one beveled edge on the end of my stick here. I'll go ahead and line that up with my design, and I will hold it carefully in place while I mark the other side. And once I've got that first piece of balsa laid in, I can pull out the spacer and then just use a bit of pressure to set that first line. So now you can clearly see that there's a bit of a gap between those two edges. That little gap is going to be very important. So go ahead and just kind of continue working all down the line, and I'll see you guys tomorrow with the next tutorial.